Welcome to this episode of Orthodontics in Interview. It's my absolute pleasure to give you guys Dr. Tommaso Castroflorio, an academic and clinician eminent across the world for his knowledge and research within aligners. Tommaso, thank you so much for joining me for this Orthodontics in Interview podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Farooq, for giving me this great opportunity.
And I'm so excited we've managed to find time to do this. And I want to give you guys a bit of background of Tommaso Castroflorio. So he's based in Italy, in Turin. Now, he also did his dental degree as well as his specialism in orthodontics from the University of Torino, and that was back in 1998, and his specialism in orthodontics in 2001. He's also completed a PhD. He was also an aggregate professor and chair of orthodontics at the University of Torino in 2014. He's led the postgraduate program. Now, from an academic perspective, Tommaso has done everything within research. He's carried out trials, publications, had over 100 peer-reviewed publications in total. He's written textbooks, and the most notable textbook in terms of aligners is the Biomechanics and Principles of Aligner Orthodontics. And that was written with co-authors Professor Ravi Nanda, Francesco Guarino, and also Kenji Ojimi, real giants within orthodontics, which Tommaso very much is. He's an editorial board member of the Journal of Aligner Orthodontics. He's also a founding member of the European Aligner Society. He now works in private practice in Torino in Italy. He has a wife and 3 children who are semi-professional, I would suggest, in terms of skiing, which occupies all of Tommaso's weekends. So Tommaso, thank you so much again for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Farooq, for the nice introduction. And thanks again for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure to share some time with you and with all the friends around the world following your podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, Tommaso, I want to get into the first bit, and I appreciate you actually have an academic pedigree across different spectrums of orthodontics. So you've got stuff on TMD that you've done, you've got other stuff relating to other components of the science, but today really is a focus on aligners. So I want to know, how did you as a clinician or academic get into the field of aligners?
Yeah, so I started as a clinician in 2002, 2003. It was the very pioneering time of aligners. And I was still at the university as a lecturer for the School of Orthodontics in Torino. And I discovered one of the first papers published about Invisalign aligners. And it was something really, amazing at the time. We are talking of the very beginning of the 2000s, so it was a real novelty in the aligner field. Well, the real novelty was the application of the technology in the orthodontic field. So that was the first approach. I started treating a couple of patients. It was around 2003, yes. But I finished that cases with fixed appliances. The initial experience was not so good at all. So I didn't choose aligners anymore till 2009, 2010, when Align introduced the Invisalign Teen in Europe. And with this product, the power ridges were introduced. And when I saw for the first time the image, the picture of the power ridge, I understood that something was changing. So someone was speaking about biomechanics with the Invisalign engineers, and since then I started using a little bit more Invisalign aligners in my practice. While at the university, it was not possible because the professor was against aligner from the very beginning, and I had to wait till 2013 when I came back to the university as a researcher to start working again. Well, to start working with aligners also in the research setting. So my first approach was not so positive as a clinician. While as a researcher, the real pushing was represented by the fact that there were no publication. So we had a lot of case reports, a lot of guru opinions, but no research. So it was quite easy starting doing something as a retrospective studies on the early experience that we had. And in this field, I have to say thank you also to Francesco Garino, because Francesco is a professional brother, because we met in 2010, and we started sharing our experience. Francesco is an excellent clinician, and he was one of the first Italian orthodontists certified by Align Technology. One of the first 3 Italians certified. So he started in 2001 with Invisalign, and so in 2010 we decided to share our experiences. So it was more clinician. We shared more clinical experiences, where I tried to put on the table my research experience, and I think starting from this integration, we started doing some nice works together, also with the team, obviously, at the university. So this was my approach. And from an academic perspective, I have to say that we had a huge contribution from Align Technology. They were really open in doing research, and I have to admit that it was a real independent research, because we we did not have any pressure from them regarding the results that we had. So I think it was from my perspective, a really nice experience as a starting point. As a clinician, as I told you, at the beginning was not so easy, not so good. But when I started in my practice using again aligners in 2009, 2010, it was starting from very simple cases. I think this is the right approach. Now, starting from the very simple cases, small relapses, for example, of the anterior, or just simple alignment, and case by case, I built my clinical experience, because research is important, but we have also to consider that we are orthodontists, and we have to put on the table our knowledge, our basic principles, and this is something that I believe is very important to build our personal clinical experience with every technique, and with aligners also.
That's really insightful, Tommaso. So it's interesting. You've gone from the academic side and then integrated it into your clinical side of things, which is interesting in itself. You're picking up on those limitations that you described. So I found this quotation from you from a previous interview, and it was, despite the limitations of aligners, the introduction of Invisalign to your practice that you mentioned has really improved the patient experience. So I want to explore this on 2 fronts. The first, what those limitations are of aligners, and just kind of signpost some of the research. So we've got Neil Kravitz's 2 kind of very hallmark studies from 2009 and again 2020 with Julio as the author. And it showed really just a transition of around 10% of predictability of lines within that decade of clinical practice. So what are the limitations that stand now with aligners? And how do you see us perhaps navigating those?
Okay, so that's a super nice question. I love it from the very beginning, the study by Neil Kravitz from 2009, because it was really inspiring, and it was I think the first scientific study that we had about modern aligner orthodontics. And also I appreciated a lot the study by Willie and the same team with Neil from 2020 on the American Journal. Yes, we had apparently just a 10% of improvement in 10 years, but in the paper coming from this group and published in 2020, there is a nice sentence in the discussion section stating that the 74% of randomly chosen patients coming from that sample had passed the ABO score. So, predictability of single movements is one aspect. And the clinical result, the optimal clinical result is another aspect. And it means that the appliance is important, but I think that more important than the appliance is the orthodontist. At the end, the appliance is a tool, and this is something that is always has been always misunderstood in aligner orthodontics evidence. There are a lot of papers stating that talking about Invisalign. Invisalign cannot treat class 2 patients. Invisalign cannot treat extraction cases, or aligners cannot do this or cannot do that. Okay, there are some intrinsic limitation, obviously, as in every technique. But we have to remember that the appliance is a tool, and a trained orthodontist can manage almost every limitation of the appliance. So if we have to talk about inherent limitation of the technique, we know that the rotation of rounded teeth is not predictable. We need to overcorrect these single movements. We have to plan the use of attachments, and probably we will go further into this. Also, the control of the torque information is not so predictable with aligners, as well as complex movements as lower molar mesialization, for example, or the closing of extraction spaces. So I know that there are limitations, but in my experience, I always try to understand why these limitations were evident in my clinical practice, and try to find a way to overcome this limitation. So, for example, I think that clinical studies are very important, and we need them. We need definitely a lot of RCTs and prospective studies about aligner orthodontics. But in the last years, we had a lot of finite element model analysis study that, in my opinion, are very important, are really important, because these are independent studies explaining, the behavior of the material of the aligner. Because as orthodontists, we know everything about, the properties of 90 wires or stainless steel wires or TMAs, but we do not know anything about the deformation of aligners coming from Align or Angel Aligner or Spar or Ormco or 3M, whatever. And I think that the big difference in overcoming the limitation is to understand how to control aligner deformation. And from this point of view, all these finite element studies are really useful. They are providing useful information that we need to translate into the clinical setting, and that's the reason why we need clinical studies then. But I think that limitations are limitations in every technique, and I think that the good orthodontist is the orthodontist that is able to understand how to manage the limitation and how to overcome them. So with overcorrection, for example, or with auxiliaries, preparing, reducing the complexity of certain movements, or just to, preparing the anchorage. For example, the anchorage concept, that is a basic concept in orthodontics. When you read some papers, or when you see some cases on the web or on the journals, it seems that anchorage is not existing. So the management of anchorage units is something that is a basic concept in orthodontics, and that for a lot of years was not transferred to aligner orthodontics. No, when you see the virtual setups, you always see a lot of tooth moving at the same time, without asking yourself which is the unit of the anchorage unit for control that movement, for example. So I think that limitations are there. We have to work to reduce the amount of those limitations. But again, I think an important concept is that we are orthodontists and we have to bring our knowledge also in aligner orthodontics. And this is something that is not well understood, especially in the academic world. There are a lot of schools in which they do not talk at all about aligners because there are a lot of prejudice about that. But one of the aspects that have always been discussed was represented by the pressure of the companies on orthodontists and because of the aligners. But again, if we as orthodontists do not try to control the technique, therefore we will always have companies pushing us. So I think that as clinicians and as researchers and academics, we need to talk about aligners. We need to improve the available knowledge about aligners because of this, because we need to control companies. We do not need companies controlling us. That's the reason.
That's really interesting, Thomas. So I think you've touched on a number of topics there about the orthodontist being the expert within the biomechanics, but actually we haven't necessarily applied our depth of understanding to biomaterials in this particular product itself, and are only perhaps now starting to gain some more understanding of the material itself. You mentioned about the academic component opinions of aligners. Now, the most commonly quoted systematic review is the one that you did with Rossini in 2015, which is an incredible kind of state of research for aligners, and I think set the bar as to what research should be carried out with aligners. We've had systematic reviews since. So Yasa published theirs in 2022, which was a systematic review of systematic reviews. Now, one of their concluding statements, and this was only 3 years ago, that aligners are restricted to mild to moderate cases. So as a clinician and academic, how do you now phrase that conclusion with respect to your academic understanding, but also your clinical practice?
Well, that's a super question. I think yes. If I need to teach to students when to apply aligners, then my recommendation will be okay. You have to restrict them to mild to moderate cases, because I need students navigate in a calm sea in their daily clinical practice. But again. And yes, Yasir and Yasir are right, considering the available evidence that we have, honestly. So I think that from an academic point of view, yes, this is a right recommendation, and I will provide them to my students. From a clinical point of view, I think that again, going back to what I said before, if you are a well-trained orthodontist and you know what are you doing, because that's another important aspect to consider. I think you can treat also complex cases. In my practice, I treat extraction cases. I treat the cases in which I need to close anterior spaces for a genesis of the upper laterals, and I work with aligners, buttons, and elastics without fixed auxiliary. So again, I think if you have a good knowledge of the limitations of the technique, and if you understand how to control the deformation of the aligner, you can obtain excellent results also in complex malocclusion, also in complex cases.
So let me pick you up on that specifically to do with extraction. So again, there's clearly a dichotomy. There's a separation between research output and what you're describing in terms of clinical practice. So there's a series of papers from Tony Ware's Australasian Aligner Research Group, and one of those focused on extractions. And what they found was that in 217 cases of Australian orthodontic practitioners, that there was a massive variation in control of the teeth adjacent to extraction sites, from 7% under expression to 250% on the other side. And essentially, they concluded that aligners would tip, in these cases, in this research, would just tip teeth into the extraction site. Is this a limitation in understanding in terms of clinical practice? Why are orthodontists, I would suggest, phrasing it another way, still not able to reliably manage extraction cases, at least according to this study?
Well, I think, well, I don't believe that aligners are tipping teeth in the extraction spaces. Otherwise, why we should use aligners to treat extraction patients? No. So again, there are limitations that are limitation if you do not consider how to overcome the limitation or how to control aligner deformation. So, for example, when and there are some useful studies that are mathematical studies, finite element model studies that are suggesting us some tricks to better control, for example, the retraction of the the anterior teeth in upper and lower first premolar extraction. For example, I was thinking to two studies that were published on the American Journal, in one in June and the second in August of 2023. The first was, sorry, I have some notes here. The first was from, Liu, June 2023 on the American Journal, and the second by Rui Kong Yang, August 2023 on the American Journal. And these are papers that I suggest to everyone to read, because extraction cases are the best cases to understand what I mean when I say control aligner deformation. And when you read these papers, you will better understand this, because they analyze the problem, but they also try to provide us the suggestions that we need in our daily clinical practice to avoid the issues that typically we have in extraction cases. No, so if I think that aligners will tip teeth in the extraction spaces if you trust the company indications. Okay, so if you close your brain in a box and just apply the information that you have from the company in your virtual setups, in your CleanChecks or whatever other software you will use. But if you plan your case with those knowledge, then you will see that probably you will be able to obtain the same result that you will obtain with your fixed appliances. And for example, the second study, the one published in August, is really useful to understand how to prepare your anchorage unit to retract your premolars. To retract the anterior teeth in this extraction.
So, Tommaso, that's really interesting as you describe the limitations as far as what can happen with aligners, but also it's the biomechanics at the end of it, which is by the biomechanist who is going to ultimately deliver the success of the case, and the equivalence that could be achieved if we're able to control the material, as you mentioned about the deformation of it. I suppose also what you described there, if it was a truly tipping appliance, orthodontists wouldn't use it for extraction cases. And in Tony Weir's group, clearly there was a number of extraction cases there for them to do the research. So evidently orthodontists must think it has merit to actually treat it with patients. Tom, so there's a quotation of yours I wanted to explore as to what the advantages you've stated of aligners previously, and if that's something that can map now to fixed appliances. So you mentioned here that the introduction of Invisalign into your practice has really improved the patient experience. From the start of the journey, sharing information and providing a visualization of a tooth movement, and how that visual element plays an important role in our contemporary media culture. So I was interested in this quotation of yours and wanted to know, well, does that visualization help you to understand perhaps these limitations as clinical outcomes or to plan your biomechanics? But also now with digital fixed appliances, both customized and indirect appliances, we can now visualize fixed appliance outcomes. So do you think that now that significant advantage, which was once just for aligners, now can also be applied to fixed appliances?
Yes, definitely yes. I think that no, we know that we are living in a visual society. No, that's the reason why we have this podcast, for example. No, having videos is very important. It's a communication channel that is really that is working quite well. The visualization of the orthodontic movement, I think it's super important for us as orthodontists, because what I try to explain each time to my students, for example, is that they will have the visualization of their own idea of orthodontics about that patient. And having this visualization is really important, because you can understand your mistakes and you can improve your biomechanics. You can you can correct it every time. So I think it's important not only from uh, let me say from a biomechanical point of view, but it's also very important from a diagnostic point of view. It will help us a lot, in improving our in our diagnostic process, our treatment plan, and then our mechanics. From a patient perspective, it's very important, because I try to explain to my patients with the with the virtual setup, with the visualization of the treatment plan. I try to explain them why we need, for example, attachments, or why we need auxiliaries, why we need at a certain point having let me say a class 2 elastics on it, or why we probably will need some additional aligners at the end of the first set, because there are some complex movements, or because the predictability of the rotation of that lower canine is not excellent. So um, it's something I think really useful, and I think it's useful for us as orthodontists, even for lingual or buccal orthodontics, if we have the opportunity of having this visualization. In my practice, I I've been using the Invisalign the Ormco Insignia from 2008, from the very beginning, and it I can say that is a super tool. Is a super tool. It's a way in which the patient can understand what are going to do in their mouth, why we need their cooperation, you know. Um, and it's a useful tool for every technique, also during the treatment, because once you have your patient on the chair, and you can take some pictures, and you can compare the pictures with the corresponding stage of the aligner setup, or of the fixed appliance setup. It's a way, another way in which we can use this tool to motivate the patient during the treatment. So I think they are very useful, and they represent something that we need to use every day with I think every patient in our practice.
Really interesting, Tom. So you kind of went straight down into it's the biomechanics and the explanation of those and where limitations lie, as opposed to as opposed to how perhaps it's perceived visualization. It's just to show beginning and end, and look, it's almost like a sales tool. You're actually describing it from an opposite direction, which is really interesting and obviously much more clinically centric, as opposed to the advertising side of it. And you didn't even mention it. So if anything, it's making it sound more challenging to patients when they get to visualize it with elastics and buttons and other bits. Tom, so you've done some research in the past looking at mandibular advancement and twin blocks and class 2 correction. Now, this is an interesting area where we've had kind of very cost-effective twin block or modified twin block appliances, both in the UK and in Italy, quite popular appliances. We've got fixed versions, the Herbst. We've got Forces and other class 2 correctors, which then had non-compliance associated with it. And then we've got the aligner version, where there's mandibular advancement taking place. Now, within these kind of three facets, we now have research that looks at part-time wear of twin blocks. So Jeet Parekh, an old student of mine, did his 2019 study, which had part-time and full-time wear as effective as each other. So there's a kind of drive towards part-time functional appliance wear. And there's, of course, a cost effectiveness towards having something which is cheaper, like a twin block appliance, and less commitment from the patient's perspective. So within this kind of change that's happened in research in the last 6 to 7 years, where do you see aligners, mandibular advancement appliances fitting into what's also available in the market today? Is it something that is your preference? Is it ideal? Are the limitations with it? And are the other ones perhaps to a degree more cost effective and less compliance based?
Yeah, well, that's a nice topic. Well, I have to say that with respect to the past, I reduced a lot the use of the mandibular advancement appliance in my clinical practice. And the reason is that with the experience that I had, and also in analyzing the cases that we treated at the university, and we published also something about that, I understood that there are some limitations in the appliance that are related to, obviously, to the selection of the patient, and mainly are related to the position of the wings on along the arch. And the twin block has always been my reference as appliance, and I have to talk about impression because I do not have evidence about that, but I came to the conclusion that if the wings are located posteriorly, close to the molar, at the end you will not have the desired correction, and probably because of the height of the wings, because the patient start to clench in the molar region above the wings. While we had the greatest results when the wings were located in the premolar region, in the first premolar region. And if we think to the design of the twin block, the planes are located in that region, are not located so posteriorly. So I think that there are some limitations related to the effects that are biomechanically related, and that's the reason why I reduced a lot the use of this appliance in my practice. And I've tried to push Align and the engineers in modifying these aspects, but sometimes you have not good feedback from them, and I think they have changed the design of the wings, and now probably they will also change something else. But so far, considering the cost also of the appliance, I think that in our practice we have more efficient and more efficacy also from coming from the twin block, considering also the results that we can obtain with a part-time use of the appliances. Because when we talk about function, well, my school, the school of the Torino University, has always been a functional school, so we have in our background a lot of functional background. The problem is always, the cooperation of the patient with these bulky appliances in their mouth along the entire day, especially during the school time. So having the possibility of obtaining good results with a part-time wearing of the appliances is something that we need to explore, definitely. And so that's the reason why I'm not so enthusiastic with respect to the mandibular advancement appliance as I was at the very beginning. We had nice results. If you consider some morphological indicator, predictive indicator coming from Franchi and Baccetti from the past, and if you properly select the patient during the pubertal spurt, you can obtain excellent result also with the mandibular advancement device. But again, sometimes the fact that I cannot decide where the wings can be located I think it's a huge limitation of this appliance.
Okay, that's a really honest answer, and thank you so much for exploring that idea, which I know is discussed in different directions, but it's great to get somebody who's familiar with all of them. Um, you mentioned about the visualization and attachments, and I want to pick up this conversation about attachments and attachment design. Now, there's been some research in this topic, and might maybe not be the most robust, but we've got retrospective studies, and we've got now. Finite and model analysis as well. So we've got from Tony Ware's group, 2024 paper. We've got Rari Nanda's paper with Kawamura in 2023 and Karos 2021. And essentially they looked at no attachment designs, conventional attachments, and certain proprietary designs for attachments. And essentially concluded that there doesn't seem to be a design which is perfect. They all have some discrepancies with them. And actually, no one design, whether it's a different conventional design or proprietary design, seems to offer any benefit relative to others. And my question to you, Tommaso, is have we gone beyond the point of realizing that it's not the shape that's that important? Are there inherent limitations, as you mentioned with the plastic deformation, which mean that actually this area of research is not going to progress? We're not going to find the answer? Or is it that we're so early in this type of research on this topic, there's lots more left to gain, and we are going to get to the answer of the attachment design to help with our liner cases?
Well, that's another super question. So I think that we need attachments. Okay. Considering the state of the art of aligner orthodontics, we need attachment to control complex movements, to control anchorage, to overcome the limitation that we discussed. So for example, just to give you a clinical example, if we are talking about the retraction of anterior teeth because we have distalized or we have extracted or we have some diastema in the anterior, and we plan to retract the anterior without any information, okay, on the posterior, at the end we will have always a mesial tipping of the posterior teeth. So we need attachments on those crowns in order to have a distal crown tipping information during the retraction to be expressed. So I think we need attachment to control almost every movement. And okay, probably we still not have the optimal design, and probably we will need optimal design that will be specific for specific movements. So far, I can tell that the rectangular vertical attachment probably is the most reliable attachment that we have, and there are some studies telling us that the longest is the attachments, the better you can control the movement of the tooth. However, for example, in our retrospective study that we published on Progress in Orthodontics in January 2023, I think, we saw that we analyzed some Invisalign cases treated by me, by Simone, by other Italian colleagues. And we saw that, for example, we have some optimized attachments that are working quite well. The results that we obtained were comparable to those obtained with conventional attachment for the same tooth, for the same movement, while others, optimized attachments, are not working properly. So again, the design of several attachments is not the ideal one. But my premise is that we still need attachments. We know that today with the direct printed aligners, we have speakers and colleagues telling us that the attachments are not needed anymore. But I believe that we are still in a very early stages of direct printed aligners experience, and the cases that I saw coming from my friends and from my colleagues, like Kenji, or from the presentations of Ravi, for example, are not complex cases. Are cases in which the alignment is reached by proclinations and IPR. So it's obvious that the tipping movement is the easiest movement that we can control with aligners. So it's obvious. It's quite obvious that you do not need attachment to procline a lower incisors, for example, a lower incisor. But I think that we still need attachments. We still need studies, explaining us how the thickness of the aligner can affect the predictability of the movement, or the trim line. We know that higher trim line of the aligner will increase the stiffness of the aligner, and therefore for certain movements, maybe having a higher trim line will reduce the need of attachments. But we are still in a stage, as I told at the very beginning of these answers, considering the state of the art, the current state of the art, we still need attachments. And I think that it's thinking of doing orthodontics without attachments is like thinking to bond some night eye wire, 016, for example, on your crowns with some composites. You will see some movements, obviously, but without any control, So I think that with aligners, without attachments, we could face the same experience. So we will see some movements, but without any control of the root movements, for example.
Advancing that question, so attachments are one auxiliary. The use of elastics and mini screws and sectional fixed appliance and hybrid cases seems to be how clinicians are able to manage more complex cases. But these are sometimes not the same. We have to use perhaps more of these auxiliaries than we do with conventional labial appliances. So would you say, therefore, that we are kind of making up for the limitations in the appliance using these auxiliaries? Is it that we've not managed to understand the interaction between the plastic and the tooth well enough yet to be able to reduce our reliance upon auxiliaries? Or do you think auxiliaries are always going to be there just by the nature of how aligners are?
Well, huge question. Well, I think that for some movements, definitely we need auxiliaries. Okay, so we need elastics to control anchorage, for example, anterior anchorage in class 2 cases, non-extraction cases, when we want to distalize. We could need auxiliaries like TADs to increase the power of anchorage units. But I strongly believe that we still miss the ideal material. Okay, because behind the attachments, behind the predictability, we do not consider that we are talking about a material that is not the ideal material. We had good materials coming from different companies, but we are still missing the ideal one. So I think that some auxiliaries are needed to counteract the aligner deformation effects. Other auxiliaries are used by orthodontists because they do not fully understand the biomechanics of the system. Okay, so I think that both the sentences are right. So sometimes we need auxiliaries to improve our performance because there are inherent limitations of the biomechanics that need the use of auxiliaries. On the other side, there are situations in which orthodontists are using auxiliaries because they do not fully understand how to control aligner deformation. So I think this is the most balanced question that I can provide you.
That's great. Really great insight. And I suppose it's relative to fixed label appliances. This is still a really, to quote Ravi Nand, it's still a really early appliance that is still in its developmental stages, as is our understanding of it. I wanted to move on to describing more of environmental consequences, both to ourselves as people, but also for the great environment. So there's been two discussion topics specific to aligners. So one of those is by Theodore Elidias, an established academic, and he published in the Journal of WFO last year. He described the consequences of microplastics and aligners. And he went into exploring, which is a narrative a paper about microbacteria, how can it cause effects to both toxicity within human beings and functional components specific to do with liver and other aspects. So this has been put forward now as a potential consequence of aligners, and it's quite alarming, its health consequences for us. we haven't had research specifically or directly related to this topic, but it's now being put forward as a hypothesis. What's your thoughts on this hypothesis or this idea? And what do you think we should do next? Should we stop using the appliances? What are your concerns when you read these types of papers?
Well, my reaction is always honestly a mixed reaction between being scared about that. On the other hand, I always think that we're still missing some direct evidence supporting these statements. For example, last week on LinkedIn, one of our colleagues published a post coming from a US group stating that nanoplastics are responsible of older dementia, and the average age of patients diagnosed with dementia is 83 years old, and the intention was to relate this result to the use of aligners, and my thought was, well, 83 years old man, probably never seen an aligner in his life. However, this does not mean that I'm not scared about the potential effects of microplastic and nanoplastics. And I think that Professor Eliades raised a very important topic that is important for research. I don't think we will stop using aligners. I think this is another important point from which we need to start another research field related to the future of the materials that we use in our daily practice. For example, we already have researchers coming from the internal medicine field stating that there are some plastics that can be used and can be integrated in the human being without any side effects. So I think that the pollution coming from the use of plastics is an important topic. We have always to understand that almost between the 30 and the 50% of the nanoplastics that we have, nano and microplastics that we have in our body, are coming from what we breathe from the air, so not from something that we are chewing or clenching in our mouth. So again, it's an important topic. We have to it's important to be aware of this, and we need research showing us what if what we are doing in our patients is really dangerous, and it potentially can hurt the patient health. And I know that last week probably Professor Kevin O'Brien published in his blog the results of a paper analyzing the long-term effect of vacuum thermoformed retainers on the cellular reaction of human cellular reaction. And there are some nuclear alterations. Now we have to understand if this nuclear alteration can lead to potential real effects or not. So my position is a researcher position. So we need evidence. We need researchers stating in a clear way if we need to change our approach to the patient, but mostly if we need evidence supporting the fact that we need different materials. And this is something that I was claiming even before these studies, because as I told you before, this is the materials that we are using are not the ideal materials. We need biodegradable materials. We need materials that can interact with the metabolomics of our patients. Imagine to use materials that can enhance orthodontic tooth movement biologically. This is something that represents the future of one of the future aspects of aligner orthodontics. So my advice is to keep to 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 keep the right attention to this topic, avoiding terroristic advices. As for every aspect of medicine, we need evidence, and once we will have clear evidence, we will decide what to do on with our profession.
And moving on from, well, related to that, you mentioned the future of orthodontics, a future for aligners, having that biological interaction as a material. What other aspects of aligners do you see as being their future? So you've described the nature of the material changing. What else do you see advancing this profession to perhaps reduce the unpredictability when it comes to its clinical practice? You've described education already in terms of understanding biomechanics. I think that's always going to be the orthodontist. We should be doing that. That is our specialty, our expertise. But as a field in itself, what else do you see growing our understanding and delivering more predictable outcomes?
Well, I think, yes, education is really important. I think I want to underline that the academic field needs more people teaching aligner orthodontics, at least obviously the basics of aligner orthodontics, just to keep the students away from company pressures. Yes, materials. It's I think material is the most important field of development. We know just from a couple of years, 5 years, we started thinking about smart materials. The memory shape thermoplastic material. We know that in orthopedics, for example, they already use plastic materials that can change their shape in a very important way when in contact with blood or at 37 degree of body temperature. So I think that from this, the materials will represent the most important aspect of evolution, not only for aligner orthodontics, but for the whole orthodontics, I think. And I strongly believe in that. And the other aspects, I think, are related to the 3D printing technology. I think not only for, mainly not for the in-office production of aligners. I think that, and if you have experience, I have a printer in my office. I have I have a printer. I just print my retainers. I do some minor relapse correction. But that this requires a lot of time, a lot of investments. You need space. You need to spend a lot of time and a lot of money to have these devices in your office. And I think that large mass 3D printing will represent another important evolution of orthodontics for braces and also for aligners. So this probably will be the immediate step. And then I think we will see huge novelties in the material world.
I want to conclude with just two final questions, Tommaso. The first is, you are an established academic, a resource with your knowledge base and what you've published as well. But who is it you admire the most within our field of orthodontics?
I had different heroes, but my superhero is Ravi Nanda. And this Ravi, why? Because in 2017 I was in Tokyo to give a lecture about aligners for a scientific society, and I found Ravi sitting in the first row. And after the lecture, I went to him and I said, "Hey, Ravi, why are you here?" And having a super ortho, a well-known professor, and a myth like Ravi, answering, because I'm curious to know what aligners can do. Considering his age, I will never say that he's an older guy, but he's an old guy. But considering his age and all the background that he had, this answer was really an open-minded answer, because I'm curious. And I think that having people like him keeping the right, curiosity for the innovation that are out there, it's an excellent example of what an orthodontist should be. Always being curious, always being curious without any prejudice. This is the most important thing, I think. So does not mean that you have to believe everything. My grandfather say you have to give trust to everyone, but don't trust everyone. And so being curious. So I think that's very important.
Great. And just to conclude with the final question, Tommaso, what one piece of advice would you give to the orthodontic community who are listening?
Well, to be curious, it's the most obvious. But avoiding prejudice, I think, is the most important part. So, and to avoid prejudice, I think it's very important to know the evidence that we have. Without, what I hate the most is the orthodontist answering to questions with dogma. As we were talking about religion, and orthodontics is not a religion, is not politics. We are talking about medicine. We are talking about biology. So being curious, I think it's and being open-minded is always the best advice that I can give to people out there. Again, this doesn't mean that you have to believe everything, or you have to believe everyone, or you have to trust everything and to trust everyone. But finding the right source of information. We have PubMed. Everyone has free access to PubMed, and and we as orthodontists we know which are the journals that are most reliable: the American Journal, the European Journal, Progress in Orthodontics, Angle Orthodontist, the Korean Journal, and the Journal of Clinical Orthodontics. And please forgive me if I not mention a couple of other
Journal of Orthodontics as well.
Journal of Orthodontics, the Journal of the World Federation of Orthodontists, Seminar in Orthodontics. Well, okay, we have 10 good journals, excellent journals that can provide us the right information that we need. And having a proper information is the secret to be prepared to evaluate properly what we face every day.
Tommaso, thank you so much for your time and joining me on Orthodontics Interview Podcast. To the audience, please do subscribe and look forward to the next episode. Thank you so much, Tommaso.
Thanks to you, Farooq. It was really a super pleasure.